welcome to the Forsters More Than Law podcast. I'm Miri Stickland, knowledge development lawyer in the commercial real estate team, and I'm joined today by Glenn Dunn, who's the partner who leads our corporate occupier sector group, and Glenn's also the architect of our own recent consolidation of our commercial real estate group under one roof, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later. Welcome, Glenn.
Morning, Miri.
Thanks for joining me. Today we were going to go through some of the sort of top tips for office relocations for corporate occupiers. So I guess just to start us off, how far in advance do you think that occupiers should start thinking about their office move?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Miri, particularly when you look at what's happening in the central London office market at the moment, where there's definitely a mismatch between supply and demand. So what you used to see, was maybe sort of 2 years would be an adequate time to consider a relocation.
Yeah.
But in fact, if you look now at the demand, people are starting to think about things maybe 3 years, and in fact, as you may have seen from the legal press, a number of law firms are already declaring potential moves even through into the mid-2020s,
right?
Which seems an awfully long way away.
Yeah, and I suppose you would not only think about when you actually might need that requirement, but also how it's going to match up with what your existing...
Exactly, and a lot of this relocation, of course, is triggered by lease events.
Yeah.
And those, of course, aren't regular in pattern. It is a difficult one to because you've got to weigh up a number of sort of competing interests. Not least, you can start it at any time, but of course, what you want to do is to bring delivery in a sensible fashion towards your lease expiry, so that you don't get caught with double overheads, with rent, rate, service charge, which are very expensive.
Yeah.
I would say early planning is really key to all of this. The earlier you start, the more options you have.
Yeah.
The later that you leave it, the challenge that you have is that the landlord of your current premises will have a greater leverage over you because they realise you're not going to have time to relocate.
Yeah.
And that's quite a key driver, I would say. So the earlier you start, the better your chances, of potentially twin tracking those discussions, and maybe getting a great deal from your existing landlord, which is worth you staying if you can get a whole refurbishment of your building at no cost. Then that needs to be properly considered.
There's lots of things to think about.
Indeed.
So can you talk us through some of the key things that occupiers would want to think about both before and during the process of finding new premises? I know that you can speak to this with both your personal and professional hats on, because we've recently relocated our commercial real estate group into Berkeley Square House, just over the road from our main offices at 31 Hill Street. Yeah, so I'm sure you can put a bit of personal insight in there for us.
Yeah, I think a lease event is a great opportunity to review your business strategy and to see perhaps what you could do better, what you're missing out on, or indeed wholly new trends that may be coming down the track. And for us, as a partner in our commercial real estate mainstream group, I obviously do quite a lot with our specialist groups, including property litigation, construction and planning. But we've all been in different buildings, and that has meant that we've potentially missed opportunities that we might have had, if we had seen each other in person rather more. And in fact, it definitely seems to be a trend with a number of corporates, particularly those sort of in the creative sectors, where when architects are designing buildings for them, they look at creating these collision zones which sort of force employees to bump into each other and therefore to chat and to exchange ideas, and it really sort of reinforces that feeling of brand, and that you are all one firm.
So you really want to think, I guess, early on then about who you're actually moving into the space that you're going to occupy.
Very much so.
And how the design of that is going to facilitate collaboration.
That's right. And I think sort of having flexibility is key there, because all sector groups, departments in any business, they change size over time. And when you're looking potentially, at a 10-year lease renewal or a new lease of space, that the groups that you put into any one floor of that space, will hopefully be bigger, but sometimes they may be smaller. And to be able to do that effectively, requires you to think ahead to see how you could accommodate growth, indeed to try and assess what that growth might be. And whilst there's no certainty in that process, where you ultimately want to be is to minimise disruption. Particularly what you absolutely don't want is to have to be refitting space, very soon after you've moved in, because the design doesn't work. So there's a lot to think about in the design phase, and it has to really be done in tandem with what you want to achieve as a business going forward.
And so which sort of specialists would you try and get on board earlier on in the sort of planning stage?
Yeah, I think, clearly the key person is your agent, and there are many good agents who are operating, whether it's in the central London market or in other markets, and you need to find the one that's the right fit for you and your business. Indeed, a number of agents are now specialising in particular sectors,
right?
And they can be very useful because they know what the trends are, they know what others have tried, and they know what's been successful and what hasn't.
They have that more granular sort of level of knowledge about
very
particular
much so.
sectors of the occupier market.
That's right. And I think once you've been able to tap into that, you're not reinventing the wheel in the same way.
Yeah.
Certain things will work for the legal sector, which I suspect don't work for financial services or for media businesses. And we work with both of those groups as lawyers, and you can see quite a difference in terms of the way that they approach design. In terms of other people in a team, you're probably looking at an architect stroke space planner to help you through the process. And one of the difficulties, I think, is again on timing, because do you design the building sort of in isolation, i.e. you work out what you need to have in the building and then go and find the building, or do you find the building first and then try and work back and fit in everything that you have to fit in? And I think there's a variety of views on that topic, but ideally you've got to find a balance, to make sure that the building that you have selected, is suitable for your requirements.
Yeah.
And then of course you get on to discussions about location, which is a tricky one for a lot of businesses because of particularly in central London, where the market has gone. You used to have the West End core and the City core, and everywhere else was a sub-market where you could get decent discounts on rent if you were willing to go there. Because of this lack of supply that I talked about earlier, we're now looking at one much more constrained central London market, which effectively goes from Paddington in the west over to pushing out to beyond the city, Shoreditch in the east, King's Cross, Clerkenwell in the north, and the South Bank in the south. So all of that has led to a situation where the savings you could get by relocating to a secondary market are just not there in the same way that they used to be.
Why do you think there is this lack of supply, given that landlords obviously will be aware of when lease events are going to be occurring, and as you've sort of mentioned before, savvy landlords will have their eye to what occupiers' requirements are likely to be?
I think really it's been the uncertainty, general economic uncertainty, no doubt a sort of a lack of funding opportunities and availability of debt. So I think you can see that a lot of the the major developments that are being built are by the big players, and rather less from your what you might call your traditional non-Premier League developer. And the funding in particular has always been difficult on a speculative basis. Those types of developers prefer to know that they have someone to take the building before they commit. And you've got to have quite deep pockets, I suspect, if you want to get away from that model. So I think the sort of the average demand over the last 10 years is about 9 million square feet of space available. And when you look a little bit down the track, coming into sort of 2022, 2023, the demand is already above that level.
Right.
So and of that demand, a fair percentage is already pre-let.
So there's going to be considerable competition between occupiers to
really
secure the sort of space that's suitable for them.
Yes, and I think that is driving a willingness to look at areas which might traditionally not have been of interest to a particular corporate. So you're seeing a sort of breakdown of that model whereby all creatives are in Shoreditch or Clerkenwell, or financial services are in the city or Canary Wharf. Businesses are willing to look at what makes sense for them to get the building that they want rather than the location. And it may be part of a growing trend towards greater sort of virtual operations in the way that we do business with our clients. I think that the number of face-to-face meetings has dropped considerably, certainly in the real estate sector. The focus is very much on getting deals done quickly, and if you can achieve that, with conference calls and maybe one all-party meeting, certainly that's the sort of model that I usually see within our occupier sector group. But other than that, much more business seems to be being done, I think, in sort of smaller, offline conversations. Because it's all about getting resolution of issues from the right person. So to take my own sector, in any sort of pre-let document, you're going to have issues to do with tax, construction, sometimes planning, and you may also have dilapidations to consider on the exit of your current premises, if you're not intending to stay. And all of those parts, can be sort of taken and dealt with almost in a self-contained basis. But you, at the same time, then my job is to pull it all together and make sure that there is a proper review of the holistic whole that sits together with the key conveyancing parts of the documents.
So talk us through the difference between taking space in a multi-let building and taking a lease of the whole of the premises.
That's a really interesting question, Miri, because that's exactly what we've obviously done now. And I think there's quite a lot to be said, for having your own front door, because it allows you to sort of control the feel, of the space, the initial impression, when you walk through the door, and that whole sort of brand and image is very important to most corporates now. But if you look at the trend, even with some very large corporates, I think they are all realising that the challenge with your own building is that it only has a finite amount of space. And when it's full, it's full. So short of taking a building which is too big for your needs and then subletting parts until you need it yourself, which of course gives you the primary financial liability on all of the space, you don't really have the opportunity to grow potentially when you need to grow, or indeed to contract. And that, I think, is dictating for a number of businesses a move away from the sort of traditional own front door to multi-lets, where you have other corporates who may or may not be in your sector, but a belief that that also is a positive, because it allows more sort of opportunity to more open-mindedness in terms of the people that you see in your building.
And from a practical point of view, it means the landlord's controlling the services, so there's
so you are effectively giving up your direct cost control to a large extent, as you say. I mean, the amount that a landlord spends on reception, security, plants, whatever aquariums, or whatever might be in the reception area, of course, typically gets paid for by tenants via the service charge. And you have the choice when it's your own building as to what you spend, subject of course to the requirements of the lease and your dilapidations at the end of the space, but typically you make those day-to-day decisions. It's very different in a multi-let, particularly if you've got a lot of competing interests, because corporates have different views about how much they're willing to spend on that front of house.
Well, that was sort of what I was going to come on to next, because I suppose, and something we've talked about separately, is occupiers' sort of increasing focus on sustainability and well-being, but I suppose that also comes at a cost.
It does. Yes, sustainability has been getting increasing traction with a lot of corporates, largely because it's sort of governed by their social responsibility policies.
Yeah.
And for some time we've been seeing cooperation clauses in leases where the landlord agrees to run its services in a sustainable way, for example.
Yeah.
And tenants sometimes agree that in carrying out their fit out they will have regard to sustainability issues in terms of the sourcing of the materials that they use, and minimising waste and such like. And all of that, I think, is going to continue in significance, not least because it's of much concern to people, younger people in the workplace, for whom these issues are very important. And it will perhaps take some time to filter through completely to the position where you have a completely smart building, which has light sensors, and the heating is all automatic, and everything just sort of has its default settings, which really help you to be properly sustainable without human intervention. But we're moving along those tracks, and I think it's a big area for landlords in terms of when they decide to design a building, to think about all of those features that corporates are going to want, because you don't really want to be retrofitting those elements after you've done your initial construction. Right,
it's better to have it in there
for sure
already.
And of course these things do come at a cost. They come at a cost to the landlord, and often through service charge, they will be higher if you're doing things sustainably. But then that's for corporates to decide whether that increased cost is something that they are willing to pay to be socially responsible.
So when you get to the stage of negotiating the legal documents, changing tax likely here, what are some of the headline points that occupiers need to focus on? We've talked about sustainability, but what are some of the other sort of areas that you see a lot of focus on?
Sure. Well, I think the first point to make, and we touched on this earlier, Miri, is you've got to have a good agent on board, because the more you can agree at heads of terms stage, the easier it is and the quicker it is to get agreement on your legal documents. Sometimes there is a tendency to park the difficult issues and say, well, the lawyers can deal with that. but ultimately the lawyers have to take instructions from their clients.
Yeah.
So you've just kicked the can down the road.
Right.
We are very much of the view that the initial heads of terms, is a joint effort between the agent, the client, and the lawyer.
Yeah.
And we each have our own perspective on what's important, and the more thorough that they are, I absolutely think that spending an extra week to get clarity and detail in heads of terms, could save you 2 or 3 weeks in legal negotiations if you leave it vague. So you're really looking at lots of practical issues as an occupier, which is quite different from the way that a landlord sees a set of heads of terms, where it's principally about what the rent is and preserving investment value.
Yeah.
But as we all know, to live in a space, whether that's at home or at work, it has to be suitable for your needs.
Yeah.
I think one issue that I try to impress on my corporate occupier clients, particularly when they are very excited about the building that they've selected and just want to get to an agreement for lease, is to though think about what does happen if during the term of the lease the space no longer suits your requirements.
Yeah.
And that might be because you've contracted, so you need to offload part of the space. It might be because you've merged or you've acquired another business, and suddenly your requirements are much bigger, which mean that you have to make a move, or indeed you move out into that other partner's space and vacate. And so the maximum flexibility that you can get in terms of both assigning your lease or leases, and that's quite important, particularly if you're taking more than one floor, to think about that, because part assignment of leases doesn't really work. So if you have, say, 4 floors in a building, you should seriously consider about taking separate leases on each of those floors. Similarly, think about what happens if you're in a falling market where you can't assign because nobody will take the space on the rent that you're currently paying. That leaves you really with subletting as your only option. And depending where you are in your lease cycle, you might be doing that with only 3 years left to go.
Yeah.
And that's when issues like the security of tenure in the 1954 Act, Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, come into play, because if you have no right to stay and you're only on a 3-year short-term deal, that may make it unattractive to a subtenant.
Yeah.
Who knows that they will then, short of reaching commercial agreement with the landlord to stay, will have to move again within that period. Another point that I find often doesn't get picked up when I review existing leases for occupiers is the ability to sublet at an inclusive rent. Because if you are on a short-term arrangement, you want much more certainty over the costs that are going to be passed down to you, and particularly if there are capital costs in a landlord service charge budget, which may be perfectly right and proper for a tenant who's there on a 10-year lease, but to pass them then through to a subtenant who's only there for 3 years, may make or break your deal.
So really it's all about trying to build in as much flexibility as possible, and I guess that also applies to alterations provisions.
It certainly does. So the typical standard will be non-structural alterations with landlord's consent, but with a proviso allowing you to create or remove internal demountable partitioning, so your typical sort of meeting room provision, without any consent, so long as you inform the landlord. And that will usually be subject to not affecting the building services, the landlord services in the building. So you have to think about the effect on air conditioning and heating. That's an easy one to get wrong when you're creating meeting rooms. You don't, they're not comfortable for people to use. Because the walls that you've put in were not designed to be in those places. So that's very much a practical consideration, but one that will cause you untold misery with your employees if you get it wrong. Of course, if you have your own building and your own front door, then you might want greater flexibility in terms of perhaps being able to do structural alterations. Not least, if you've got your own building services systems, then that may require a higher degree of flexibility within the usual consent restrictions.
And connectivity is key.
It really is, and increasingly we're finding that the lead times for bringing telecom services into buildings is getting greater. And what I absolutely say to every occupier client going into space is that almost the first thing you need to think about on your fit out is your telecom services, to know who your provider is, how long they take once you've placed an order, to install, to agree the routes, because a lot of buildings, of course, particularly multi-let buildings, have existing routes through the building which will have to be used again by new providers, and to make sure that gets maximum priority, because it's all very well having the space fitted out in time and moving your people in, but if they can't work, it doesn't make you very popular.
And handily, we've got a future podcast planned on that exact topic of telecoms, so
Great.
Watch this space. So, as we've mentioned, we have been through the process, so I was just thinking sort of final words. Are there any lessons that you've learnt as an occupier that was kind of new lessons that you're going to take forward with you?
I think when you look at any project, having people who are on the ground and are able to sort of follow up on the various strands that are involved is essential. We've got a great project team here at Forsters internally who have really supported me through that process, and increasingly I think it's about getting good quality, speedy decisions about the way forward, and then having people who can actually do the implementation. A lot of projects I think fall down because there isn't enough follow through. And you need people who are experienced in these areas, who understand about procurement on fit out contracts, and where you source the coffee machine. And in fact, the coffee machine, I'm told by many clients, is if you get the coffee right, everything else will follow. So it's sort of as binary as that in one sense, but of course to pull any project together, it takes a lot of effort by many people, and I'd really encourage the visionary thinking. I think maybe that's one thing this was always felt a bit of a gamble for us to take 130 people and put them in a fully open plan area with no single offices, even for people who had one for many years. But actually the feedback so far, I think has been pretty unanimous that people like the space. Important is to make sure that you do have your key stakeholders on board, and otherwise your project may well not achieve its full potential. That doesn't mean that you'll necessarily get unanimity. You perhaps, if you're a project leader, you have to think about maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit, because you believe that the vision is right for your business. And provided that you genuinely feel that, and you've got support, industry support, from the professionals in your external team that tell you that this is what your competitors are doing and the way they're moving to work, or indeed it might be something that's wholly unique that you want to trial. Because remember, there's nothing wrong with trying something and accepting that it wasn't necessarily, the optimal. Provided that you have the ability to reverse out of something if it's not a success.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today, Glenn. It's been really interesting chatting. So if listeners would like to listen to any of our other podcasts, you can head over to our website, forsters.co.uk. We're also on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, goodbye.
Forsters More Than Law podcast is for general information only and should not be considered to be professional advice. Forsters LLP accepts no liability or responsibility for any direct or consequential loss arising from the use of, reliance on or reference to this podcast. Forsters LLP makes no warranty or representation as to the accuracy of the information contained in this podcast. The More Than Law podcast and all copyright in it is the property of Forsters LLP, and it should not be used, reproduced or quoted, whether in whole or part, without Forsters LLP's prior written consent.